the subject of friendship, Lewis, there's an attitude with a lot of people that Lewis only had male friends. But in fact, I mean, the Inklings were an all-male group. That's probably given that impression. But also he had a lot of women friends. So I'm talking a bit about C.S. Lewis and the way of friendship, the school of virtue. And friendship was so important to Lewis, both his friendship with women and with men. So you might be expecting me to talk about every member of the Inklings, but it's but I couldn't do that, and also all the women that he knew. You'd just be here all night, I think. There's a quotation here I'll begin with. You modify one another's thought. Out of this perpetual dogfight, a community of mind and a deep affection emerge. This is what C.S. Lewis said about his enduring friendship with fellow Inkling Owen Barfield, who greatly influenced Lewis's bedrock views on imagination and myth. C.S. Lewis's writings often concern friendship, and even more often are shaped by his friendships. Characteristically common, his writings from the Chronicles of Narnia to scholarly The Discarded Image on the medieval picture of the world, seek to rehabilitate values and virtues once known and lived out in what he called the Old West. He saw this as a civilization and consciousness increasingly lost to us since an unprecedented fracture which occurred, he speculated, early in the 19th century. Loss of these old virtues and values, he famously argued in his book, The Abolition of Man, put the very future of our humanity in jeopardy. It wasn't Lewis who was putting, sorry, humanity in jeopardy. It just shows, I'm an editor, you see, I should have noticed that. One of the central values he fought to rehabilitate, both in his fiction and in his non-fiction, was that of friendship. In his life, his friendships played a dramatic role, shaping and colouring his years. My biography of Lewis is rather shaped around his friendships. Lewis took up a classical and Judeo-Christian view of friendship, which saw it as, quote, the school of virtue, unquote. Properly lived out, friendship could open the eyes of friends in a pair or group to previously unseen aspects of reality. In our modern times, the new post-Christian West and its sphere of influence, friendship for Lewis can function in a restorative way, bringing us back into contact with lost reality. The friend who follows the character of friendship with its inner laws can be very like the traveller in John Bunyan's The Pilgrim's Progress, a book deeply important to Lewis. The pilgrim has to face dangers and tribulations, finding shortcuts are anything but. Bunyan writes, some also have wished that the nearest way to their father's house were here, that they might be troubled no more with either hills or mountains to go over. But the way is the way, and there is an end. The restorative and perception-changing nature of friendship, according to Lewis, is revealed particularly well in comments he made about a friend called Jenkin, especially in contrast to one of his most important friends from Ulster, Arthur Greaves. In Surprised by Joy, Lewis reveals, quote, the first lifelong friend I made at Oxford was A.K. Hamilton Jenkin, since known for his books on Cornwall. He continued what Arthur had begun, my education as a seeing, listening, smelling, receptive creature. Arthur had his preference for the homely, but Jenkins seemed able to enjoy everything, even ugliness. I learned from him that we should attempt a total surrender to whatever atmosphere was offering itself at the moment. In a squalid town, to seek out those very places where their squalor rose to grimness and almost grandeur. in a dismal day to find the most dismal and dripping wood, on a windy day to seek the windiest ridge. Jenkin exhibited, quote, a serious yet gleeful determination to rub one's nose in the very quiddity of such thing, to rejoice in its being so magnificently what it was. In that hideous strength, two characters, we learn, become friends through a similar shared vision of the quiddity of things. I liked Lewis and Jenkin, the fictional author, and Camilla Denniston liked weather in all descriptions. Jane, a central character in the story, was surprised to discover this when she was invited on a picnic with them on a foggy autumn day. Arthur explained, "That's why Camilla and I got married. We both like weather. It's a useful taste of if one lives in England." Rather than the texts of literature, a friend provides another different vantage point from which to view reality. The focus is upon a common interest or vantage point, rather than on the person, him or herself. A friend is part of the other, the overriding characteristic of the reality of nature and supernature in Lewis's thought. For Lewis, different friends opened up reality in varying ways. Owen Barfield, for instance, was very different from Arthur Greaves, who had revealed to Lewis that he was not alone in the world. Though Barfield shared with Lewis a view of what is important and asked strikingly similar questions, the conclusions he came to usually differed radically from those of Lewis. As Lewis put it, it was as if Barfield spoke his language but mispronounced it. Throughout the 1920s, the two had waged war, what Lewis called, quote, a great war, unquote, a long dispute on the kind of knowledge that imagination can give. Furthermore, in his group of friends, the process of opening up reality was richly interactive, a constantly moving play of light. He memorably expresses this in his chapter on friendship in his book, The Four Loves. In this extract, Ronald is John Ronald Reuel Tolkien, and Charles is Charles Williams, both members of the Inklings, the group of literary friends surrounding Lewis in Oxford. And to quote Lewis here, "In each of my friends, there is something that only some other friend can fully bring out. By myself, I am not large enough to call the whole man into activity. I want other lights than my own to show all his facets. Now that Charles is dead, I shall never again see Ronald's reaction to a specifically Caroline joke. Far from having more of Ronald, having him to myself, now that Charles is away, I have less of Ronald. Hence, true friendship is the least jealous of loves. Two friends delight to be joined by a third, and a third by a fourth, each bringing out all that is best, wisest, or funniest in all the others. A group of Christian friends, in particular for Lewis, are participating in a feast which God, quote, has spread the board, and it is he who has chosen the guests." Now, looking at friendship as a virtue, Lewis saw friendship as belonging to, quote, that luminous, tranquil, rational world of relationships, freely chosen, end quote. For both himself and for Tolkien, their friendship with each other was chosen freely. Friendship was not for Lewis like affection, connected with our nerves. It was rather, quote, least biological of our natural loves. It was an intensely human love, not, quote, shared with the brutes, unquote. Friendship, like the fantasy tale, gave a person a vantage point to see the world in a fresh way. Friendship with Tolkien, he found, shook him fully awake, out of the cold dream of materialism. Though he had other close friends, Lewis would not have been the writer and thinker that he was without his friendship with them, with the highly strung visionary author of The Lord of the Rings. As for Tolkien, he found a later friend in Lewis that matched the memories of his school friends in their club, the TCBS, of whom now lay inert in the dead marshes of World War I. He relied upon Lewis's encouragement, and without him would not have completed his painstaking creation of his epic for England, as he thought of his 1,000-page story of friendship. Lewis eulogized, "This alone of all the loves seems to raise you almost to the level of gods or angels." Thinking of the company of friends after a day's walking, Lewis was certainly including Tolkien when he wrote. And here's a quote from Lewis. "Those are the golden sessions when our slippers are on, our feet spread out towards the blaze, and our drinks at our elbows, when the whole world and something beyond the world opens itself to our minds as we talk, and no one has any claim on or any responsibility for another, but all freemen and equals, as if we had first met an hour ago, while at the same time an affection mellowed by the years unfold us. Life, natural life, has no better gift to give. Who could have deserved it?" As said for C.S. Lewis, friendship was part of, quote, the school of virtue. Properly laid out, friendship could open the eyes of friends in a pair or a group, previously seen unseen aspects of reality. In our modern times, the new post-Christian West and its sphere of influence, friendship for Lewis can function in a restorative way, bringing us back into contact with lost reality. Friendship was deeply important to Lewis throughout his life. Arthur Greaves was a lifelong friend, as was Owen Barfield. Friendship formed the basis of the association of the Inklings. His friendship with Tolkien played a large part in his conversion to a Christian faith. His brother Warren, aka W.H. Warren Lewis, was also his friend, whose diaries give us the most intimate picture of his life. In the New York poet and novelist Joy Davidman, he found a friend as well as a wife late in life. He had other enduring female friendships, including an Anglican nun, Sister Penelope, and Jane McNeill from his childhood days in Belfast, north of Ireland. Lewis, looking back later in life, had mentioned he had seen a group of Christian friends and others at a feast which God had providentially spread the board and chosen the gifts. Now I'm going to mention a shared friendship with Dorothy L. Sayers, a friendship between Lewis and Sayers. Having written a biography of Dorothy L. Sayers, when I was doing research, I was absolutely fascinated by the information there was between the friendship between Lewis and Dorothy Sayers. And so that's why I've included her as one of the friends. And it tells us a lot about Lewis. He wasn't just having male friends and so on. As well as a highly literate detective story writer, a star of the golden age of the genre, Dorothy L. Sayers was author of plays and involved with theatre production, author of books on popular theology, taking in contemporary social and cultural issues, whose wartime BBC broadcasts of a radio series, Man Born to Be King, had a huge audience in Britain's darkest years. She also translated medieval romances and classics such as Dante's The Divine Comedy for a wide readership. Her creative imagination and experience of writing was part and parcel of her attractive understanding of Christian creeds, such as on God as Trinity. Creeds such as God as Trinity, and on the incarnation, such as she presented for modern readers. She explored the relation of divine and human creativity. Her exuberant faith was captured in both her fiction and non-fiction, written during a life that was far from the quiet confines of academic life as it existed at that time. She was one of several important lay writers of non-technical theology who commanded a variety of audiences, like C.S. Lewis, G.K. Chesterton, T.S. Eliot, and Charles Williams, all of whom she knew personally. Sayers revealed the enormous contribution to people's lives lay theology can achieve. She had an emphasis, rather like Lewis, on mere Christianity, which is why she stuck to the creeds rather than promoting a denomination. Now, did Sayers have anything to do with the Inklings circle? This is an important question. Sayers became friends with two of the core Inklings members, C.S. Lewis and Charles Williams. Sayers is sometimes whimsically portrayed as at least serving to be an honorary member of the Oxford Inklings circle surrounding Lewis, or who could perhaps at least be considered one of the Inklings in spirit because of her friendships with core members C.S. Lewis and Charles Williams. She, however, could not have been a member of the all-male group, even if she wore her masculine three-piece suit. And even if she had been invited to meetings, her attendance would have been rare, as she lived in Essex and London rather than Oxfordshire. This sort of inclusive portrayal is understandable, however, when affinities between Sayers, Lewis, and Williams, or even Barfield, are explored. The male friendship-based informality of the Inkling circle, in fact excluded Sayers, even as a very much personal friend of both Lewis and Williams. Now, something on Lewis and the Inklings. So I have to say a little bit about the Inklings. The Inklings as a group has always presented a daunting challenge to those who seek to portray it. I mentioned a book on the subject on that table. Oops. Sorry. This is a result of its being an informal, somewhat loose group of friends of its period that fluctuated during its existence between a reading and a conversational group. Essays presented to Charles Williams is a posthumous tribute edited by C.S. Lewis, bringing together essays by a number of Charles Williams's friends, with one exception who is not from the Inklings, who was Dorothy Sayers. The preface by Lewis memorably accesses Williams. The only non-Inkling, Sayers, interestingly, has pride of place as the first contributor in the book. Her title of her essay was "And Telling You a Story," which recounts a discovery of Dante's The Divine Comedy, her reading of which put her down to the impact of coming across Charles Williams's book, The Figure of Beatrice, 1943. The second chapter is Tolkien's seminal paper on fairy stories, first delivered at St. Andrews in 1939. Also important is Lewis's essay titled On Stories. The other chapters focus on interests also shared with Williams. Lewis's preface valuable speaks about his friendship with Williams, describing him as, quote, romantic theologian, that is, someone who considers and develops the theological implications of romanticism. Though the Inklings come over in his preface as an all-male club, it is striking that in the book, Lewis includes first among the contributors Sayers, because of the great importance of her friendship with Williams. According to Lewis, it seems she was part of an undefined group of friends of Charles Williams's. Lewis's preface, however, leaves an impression that a woman was part of a circle which could have been taken as the Inklings. It is more likely in his mind that the Inklings naturally overlapped at times with wider circles of friends, because it was meant to be a relatively unstructured group. In his preface, Lewis tellingly remarks, quote, "The variety displayed in this little group is far too small to represent the width of Charles Williams's friendships." And of course, one of those friendships was Dorothy Sayers. C.S. Lewis, however, provides a rare and authoritative window into the Inklings in his preface, which suggests a common purpose. He points out that 3 of the essays in the collection, including Dorothy Sayers, are on literature, and specifically one aspect of literature, story, or the narrative art, which is a central interest of the Inklings. Lewis writes that this is natural enough. And another quote from Lewis here. His, Williams's All Hallows Eve, that's a novel of Williams's, and my own Perilandra, as well as Professor Tolkien's unfinished sequel to The Hobbit, had all been read aloud, each chapter as it was written. They owe a great deal to the hard-hitting criticism of the circle. The problems of narrative as such, seldom heard of in modern critical writings, were constantly before our minds. C.S. Lewis, writing to the letters page in the journal Encounter in 1963, pointed out that he and Charles Williams were the only members of the Inklings who were acquainted with Dorothy Sayers. She was, he revealed, quote, "the first person of importance," unquote, who had ever sent him a fan letter. It is true that Dorothy Sayers was not in the Inklings group. She was a friend of both Lewis's and Williams's, each of whom she would visit by invitation with Lewis or by her request, as often in the case of Williams. It is difficult to isolate the one Inkling from the other. Even focusing on one inevitably brings in the other. Lewis and Williams, as friends of each other, include the question of a world outlook of at least the circle's core membership. However, Sayers didn't meet with the two together, as far as I know. Owen Barfield speculated several years after Lewis's death in 1963 that what the Inklings friends had in common was more like a world outlook, a Weltanschauung, than a doctrine. A few centuries back, he remarked, its outlook might have been described as, quote, "the matter of the Inklings," unquote. Barfield was interested in cultural changes and realities, not simply in the history of ideas, a wide interest he shared with Lewis. Barfield went further and speculated that the insights of the Inklings' worldview might be seen as a christening of the Romantic movement in our day. Tolkien's characteristic insight for Barfield was the quality of eucatastrophe, or good catastrophe, where Lewis's was joy, or the inconsolable longing of Sehnsucht. Charles Williams's was that of romantic love, whereas Barfield's own was an increasing immanence of the divine in the human, issuing from the historical incarnation of Christ, God with us, just before the start of the 1st century AD. If Barfield was right, this world outlook was not only part of the character of the Inklings, but was also shared by some kindred writers outside the club. Should this sharing include Sayers? The characteristic of the seeing in common within the group was gradually articulated and hammered out in the 1930s, setting the pattern for future writings by group members, particularly those of core members such as Lewis and Tolkien. It would be fair to say that writers or friends who were discovered to share this kind of common outlook were sometimes invited into the circle, or at least to visit. Sayers, however, who arguably shared it, was never invited to the Inklings, though Lewis would invite her to meet up with him as their friendship developed. She shared with the Inklings, at least at was in its earliest day Christianity and a tendency to write, as Lewis put it. An early indication of her compatible outlook was as far back as 1916, during the period in which she taught in a girls' school in Hull. In a lecture on a Celtic tradition she gave to fellow teachers, that is the Association of Assistant Mistresses, entitled, quote, "The Way to the Other World," she speculated about the presence of the eternal, the other, in the temporal. And this is what Sayers wrote, part of what he wrote. One must remember that though in one sense the other world was a definite place, yet in another the kingdom of gods was within one. Earth and fairyland coexist on the same foot of ground. It was all a matter of the seeing eye. The dweller in this world can become aware of the existence of a totally different plane. To go from earth to fairy is like passing from this time to eternity. It is not a journey in space, but a change of mental outlook. That's as far as I got of her, the talk that she gave. Her words could have been written by either Lewis or Tolkien, or articulated by Williams using his somewhat different vocabulary. Barbara Reynolds, Dorothy Sayers' and goddaughter, and Sayers' biographer, comments that the lecture displays Sayers' characteristic combination, quote, of the intellectual and the romantic, unquote. A similar world outlook can be discovered, as it was by Lewis, in the 19th century poet, novelist, and fantasy writer, George MacDonald, both in his fiction and in his essays. One such was called The Imagination, Its Function and Its Culture. That was written in 1867. And another called The Fantastic Imagination, 1882. Changes in outlook and consciousness captured by and caused by glimpses of another world were the very heartbeat of MacDonald, Sayers, Chesterton, and key Inklings like Lewis, Tolkien, Williams, and Owen Barfield. They all were concerned with the presence of the eternal in the temporal. This was the world outlook Barfield was referring to above. With this worldview in common, affinities between Sayers, Lewis, and Williams might be seen to be undergirded by it, as well as by friendship, their writing, and their audiences. These affinities with Sayers were also shared, though not in such a direct and personal way, by Tolkien. Now a little bit more about Sayers and Lewis. As well as sharing a world outlook, there is so much else that could be said of affinities between Sayers and Lewis, and also Sayers and Williams, given the strong impact of Williams on Lewis's writings, which was echoed by the dramatic impact of Williams upon Sayers' life and work, particularly in her turning to her translating of Dante's The Divine Comedy for the new Penguin Classics imprint. There is also an astonishing parallel between Williams's separate warnings to Lewis and to Sayers about the danger of being too much in love with a beautiful pattern of Christian doctrine, a danger Williams admitted in his own life. In the case of Lewis, the danger Williams saw was in his increasing role in intellectual Christian apologetics. In Sayers, the danger was her fervent intellectual passion for creed and dogma. The influence of the thought of the 19th century Dane Søren Kierkegaard on Williams might be seen here, whose thinking Williams introduced to the English readers in publications of his translated works as senior editor with the Oxford University Press. An important affinity between Lewis and Sayers is their letter writing. The 3 large volumes of Lewis's letters make the quality and variety of his letters evident, whether he was writing to a child, a university professor, women friends like Sayers, or the American poet and novelist Joy Davidman, a reader seeking counsel, a long-lost Irish friend, or a fellow Inkling. Dorothy Sayers was also a prolific letter writer. Her letter to Charles Williams both outnumbered her letters to Lewis, and very often the extent of them. Lewis describes her as, quote, the first person of importance, unquote, who had ever sent him fan mail. I don't mind repeating that. He in turn was to become a fan of hers. After receiving many letters from Sayers, he commented, quote, although you have so little time to write letters, you are one of the great English letter writers. And that's a strong statement from Lewis. In his letters to Sayers, Williams, as a friend and publisher, quite fervently encouraged her to write. He persistently suggested that her long letters to him, covering her delightful responses to reading Dante's The Divine Comedy for the first time, should be turned into a substantial booklet as a reader's introduction to Dante's masterpiece. Lewis and Sayers encouraged each other to write. Sayers suggested him the need to write about miracles, which maybe was the inspiration for him to write his book, Miracles. They didn't always get it right. Lewis wanted Sayers to write something against the idea of women priests. And she wanted Lewis to write on marriage, having admired his science fiction story, That Hideous Strength, and the Screwtape Letters. Not surprisingly, both declined the other's idea. Lewis publicly praised Sayers' theologically astonishing book called The Mind of the Maker, which included bringing it into his discussion of miracles in his book of that name. And this is something of what Lewis writes in the book. How a miracle can be no inconsistency, but the highest consistency, will be clear to those who have read Miss Dorothy Sayers' indispensable book, The Mind of the Maker. Miss Sayers' thesis is based on the analogy between God's relation to the world on the one hand and an author's relation to her book on the other. If you are writing a story, miracles or abnormal events may be bad art, or they may not. If, for example, you are writing an ordinary realistic novel and have got your characters into a hopeless muddle, it would be quite intolerable if you suddenly cut the knot and secured a happy ending by having a fortune left to the hero from an unexpected quarter. Now, there is no doubt that a great deal of the modern objection to miracles is based on the suspicion that they are marvels of the wrong sort, that a story of a certain kind, nature, is arbitrarily interfered with, to get the characters out of a difficulty by events that do not really belong to that kind of story. Some people probably think of the resurrection as a desperate last-minute expedient to save the hero from a situation that had got out of the author's control. In an interview, Lewis was asked which modern Christian writers had most helped him. He responded, the contemporary book that has helped me the most is G.K. Chesterton's The Everlasting Man. Others are Edwin Bevan's book, Symbolism and Belief, and Udolf Otto's The Idea of the Holy, and plays by Dorothy Sayers. Lewis's reference to Sayers' plays indirectly links with his own writing for children, because in fact, Sayers' play, The Man Born to be King, at very first was commissioned for BBC's radio, children's radio. It also draws attention to the fact that both Lewis and Sayers were steeped in the Bible. Lewis wrote of the Psalms, has many references and allusions to scripture in his writings, while Sayers totally immersed herself in the Greek texts of the four Gospels for her contemporary retelling of the life of Christ, including some translation of included text. Like Lewis, Sayers' acceptance of Christian faith on rigorous thought, like Lewis, Sayers' acceptance of Christian faith was founded on rigorous thought and inquiry. Unlike Lewis, however, she did lack an emotional conversion, as famously John Wesley had when his heart was, quote, strangely warmed, unquote, on 24th of May, 1738, about 8:45 p.m., when Martin Luther's thoughts on Paul's letters to Romans in the New Testament were being read out in a meeting. Rather central to her being, however, was what she called the, quote, passionate intellect, unquote. It had played an essential part in her faith. She didn't see thought as mechanical, emotionless, and neutral. It had to be based on a fervent love of truth and facts. Sayers was like her friends Lewis and Williams within the tradition of Romanticism. The work she particularly loved most was being rooted in the medieval world, a world of fine fabling and its characteristic romances, such as the story of Tristan and Isolde, which she translated to acclaim. As Lewis made sense of his conversion to Christianity, having passed through beliefs such as atheism, agnosticism, philosophical idealism, and pantheism, then with great reluctance affirming theism, he identified for himself the high point of Romanticism as joy, his technical term, which related to the German concept of Sehnsucht, or inconsolable longing. It was in his early allegory, the Pilgrim's Regress, written after his return to Christian faith, in a way putting a kind of John Bunyan's The Pilgrim's Progress in a contemporary setting. Interestingly, Sayers wrote a revealing review in 1955 of Lewis's autobiography of his early life up to his conversion, Surprised by Joy. Sayers pointed out that this non-allegorical book was paralleled by his allegory, The Pilgrim's Regress, written over 20 years before. Much of her review takes us through the first half of Lewis's life portrayed in Surprised by Joy and the changes in his beliefs. The final part of her review turns to the romanticism that Lewis portrayed under the quality he called joy. The romantic, Sayers, is as much at home in this aspect of Lewis's biography as the intellectual, Sayers, is in referring to Lewis's movement through ideas and beliefs. She writes with a warm eloquence which reveals her as fully at home with both the objective and subjective sides of human life. And here I quote from Sayers. And she starts off in this quote, the word joy. Professor Lewis uses this word to denote those intimations of possible beatitude which may be communicated by a word, a melody, a woman's face, a legend, a landscape, but which cannot be satisfied by the knowledge or possession of these things, nor ever recaptured by concentrating on the sensation for its own sake. For in attending to the activity of desiring, we lose the desire. To call the thing romantic does not dispose of it, still less discredit it. There is no shame in sharing the experience of Dante and Wordsworth. The desire exists, and its object is outside and other than the self. It is indeed that, quote, real other, unquote, apart from whom, as Augustine said, the soul can find no rest. Of this, however, the convert felt no assurance until he had accepted God on other grounds. Credo und intelligam. I believe so that I may understand. I believe so that I may understand. Professor Lewis, Sayers continues, writes with delightful and humorous candor, and shows all his accustomed skill in translating complex abstractions into vivid, concrete imagery. The limpidity of these waters may disguise their depth. So closely do they reveal the bottom. But any illusions about this can be quickly dispelled by stepping into the river. Now, a quick word more about Charles Williams in his life. Remember, she's a friend of, Dorothy is a friend of Charles Williams. There is no doubt that Sayers admired the Inkling member Charles Williams gently. Quote, C.S. Lewis is a writer of highly disciplined talent. Charles Williams was a really profound and original mind with the authentic mark of genius. She read The Figure of Beatrice because it was by Charles Williams, leading to her reading in wartime her mother's copy of Dante's The Divine Comedy in an air raid shelter. She declared that Williams was thereby responsible for her new interest in Dante, and she went on to begin translating the Divine Comedy from Old Italian, which she had to learn, for a recently created imprint, Penguin Classics. As she wrote, Sayers corresponded with Williams, sometimes in very lengthy letters, a long correspondence that continued up to Williams's untimely death in 1945, just after VE Day. Williams has also admired Sayers' thought and writings and suggested that her correspondence to him on Dante could be turned into a lengthy booklet. Back in 1934, Sayers' publisher, Victor Gollancz, had passed on to her a glowing letter he had received from Charles Williams, who had a review copy of her latest crime mystery, The Nine Tailors. He gushed, quote, present her sometime with my profoundest compliments. It's a marvelous book. It is high imagination. You don't do a greater book in all your serious novels this year. The end is unsurpassable. I dare say I exaggerate, but I've only just finished it and I'm all shaken. That's Charles Williams. For C.S. Lewis, she saw Charles Williams as, quote, romantic theologian, caught up with the theological implications of Romanticism. Williams's Romanticism focused on the eternal significance of the fleeting experience of romantic love. He found Dante's love for Beatrice a rich example of romantic love, as Dorothy Sayers also was to find, with Williams rather taken up with Beatrice and Sayers with Dante. John Heath Stubbs, poet and critic, pointed out, quote, Charles Williams' thought is based not on abstract premises, but on the experience of human relationships, man's relationship to a personal God and to his fellow creatures, whether as individuals or in society. Sayers took in much of Williams's insights in their resonance with her own deep-rooted Romanticism, which lived so well with her scholarly medievalism. Of the importance of the image in thought, language, and art, an importance shared by Lewis, she observed, and I found this quotation from Sayers when I first traveled to Turkey to spend 2 years there in Istanbul University. And this quote I'm going to give you now really affected me deeply. This is simply the showing of a picture. This is talking about image. This is simply the showing of a picture or the telling of a story in which the truth is shown in action and the universal structure of reality is laid bare. Because it is an image and not an argument, it speaks directly to the senses and the intuition of those to whom it is shown. And because it springs out of personal, if you like, out of existential experience, It appeals to the personal and historical experience of men and gathers into itself all the experience which they themselves are able to bring to it. And because it is rooted in the fleshly and the visible, it remains an expression of the whole of human experience. It does not encourage what is so often, rather tiresomely and unchristianly, called, quote, a more spiritual attitude to life, but rather, one might say, calls for a much more living attitude to the spiritual. And here's a note on Tolkien and medieval scholarship. Remember that these are all Lewis's friends. Sayers is someone whom today we would call an independent scholar, who was an outstanding medieval one. This is evidence for her example in her work on Dante, his beloved Beatrice. This is evidence, for example, in her work on Dante, his beloved Beatrice, and the Divine Comedy. Tolkien, too, was a leading light in medieval studies, of course. Though Dante was not at all in the center of his focus, Tolkien became a member of the Oxford Dante Society. Also, he and Lewis would enjoy reading Dante together. Indeed, Dante's Purgatory, perhaps, was an influence upon Tolkien's short story, Leaf by Niggle, which he called his purgatorial story. Both Tolkien and Sayers devoted time and effort to writing poetry. As far back when they were Oxford students, each had a poem published in Oxford Poetry 1915. Tolkien's poem Goblin Feet was a poem featuring diminutive fairies, while Sayers' lengthy lay features and reveres Oxford. Yes, remember, Sayers was born in Oxford. Both were also distinguished translators of medieval text. An early translation by Sayers was one of a powerful love story of Tristan and Isolde from the 12th century Tristan in Brittany. Later, she translated much of Dante's The Divine Comedy for Penguin Classics. Tolkien translated texts including Beowulf, Pearl, and Gawain and the Green Knight. At a turning point in her life, Sayers went from being a leading writer of detection stories to playwriting, both for the stage and for radio broadcasting. From her childhood, she had the ability to capture realistic dialogue in print, which is evident in her crime stories. As an undergraduate in the all-women Somerville College, she enjoyed dramatic roles, including a blatant role reversal of medieval courtly love by openly swooning to the sight of the charismatic leader of the Bach choir, Dr. Hugh Allen, to the fascination of her fellow choristers. Tolkien's apparent negativity towards storytelling in drama and film, Elvish drama was very different, distracts from indications in his life that his attitude could be very different. In his school days in Birmingham, he took part in theatricals with zest. After a dress rehearsal for a performance featuring Mrs. Malaprop, in which Tolkien took the role, the cast strode, still in uniform, down Corporation Street in central Birmingham for refreshments at their favoured Barrows store. Sayers, I think, would have enjoyed the spectacle. Tolkien, in later life, wrote a drama script of the Battle of Malden, which was broadcast on BBC Radio. I'm beginning to wonder whether the scope of Tolkien's central concept of subcreation could be enlarged in relation to the important exploration by Sayers of human creativity in relation to the divine trinity in Mind of the Maker. Her ideas may have developed from her experience of involvement in drama as well as writing scripts. Thank you.
Well, I feel like during today, I have been taken round a hill, round and round and round towards the top, and have sometimes seen the same view, but from different vantage points. And I love the mix of the new and the being reminded of. Well, we are speechless. It has been so full, so full. Colin, thank you so much. Something we need to flag up, I know that many of us have noticed, there are 1 or 2 books over there. And also, if I can say, as well as Colin's books, there's also Ben's book as well. And so do come and have a look. Colin, you have given us so much today, and so much has been inspirational. Lots of little nuggets through the day, which has really got me thinking. Imagination, poetry, friendship, search for joy, sub-creation, it's all been there, and with such knowledge and such insight and wonderful quotes. So thank you very, very much on behalf of all of us for your time and your preparation and for today. Thank you.